This shy teacher just broke a bully's jaw. But that kick would change everything. Dylan O'Brien had terrorized Willowbrook High for 3 years straight, controlling who sat where, who spoke when, who mattered, and who didn't. His father's $2 million donations to the school board made him untouchable, until he met Grace Mitchell on that Tuesday afternoon in October. By the end of this story, you'll discover how one moment of truth can shatter years of carefully constructed lies and expose secrets that powerful people kill to protect. The sound that echoed through Classroom 3B wasn't just bone-breaking, it was the crack of an entire system collapsing. Grace Mitchell stood over Dylan's unconscious body, her sensible teaching flats still planted perfectly in a fighter's stance she hadn't used in 8 years. Blood pooled beneath his shattered jaw. 30 students sat frozen in shock. And somewhere in Grace's trembling hands lay the power to destroy everything she'd spent nearly a decade building. But this wasn't just self-defense. This was a secret being exposed in the most violent way possible. If you've ever felt powerless against someone who seemed untouchable, if you've ever wondered what happens when the quiet ones finally snap, drop a comment about your own David versus Goliath moment. These stories matter more than you know, and your support helps us bring these hidden truths to light in ways that can change lives. Willowbrook High School sprawled across 43 acres of manicured Connecticut landscape, where Mercedes and BMWs filled the student parking lot like a luxury car dealership. The brick facades and ivy-covered walls whispered old money, prestigious legacies, and the kind of privilege that bought silence when necessary. Grace had walked these halls for 2 years as the sophomore English teacher, invisible among students who measured worth by trust fund size and family connections. She'd chosen invisibility carefully. At 26, Grace Mitchell possessed the kind of understated beauty that didn't demand attention. Shoulder-length auburn hair, usually pulled back in practical ponytails, minimal makeup, and clothes that screamed serious educator rather than notice me. Her classroom walls were covered with inspirational quotes about literature changing lives. But Grace knew the real power of words lay in the stories they could hide. Dylan O'Brien commanded Willowbrook's social hierarchy like a general surveying conquered territory. At 17, he stood 6'2" with the kind of blonde hair and blue eyes that graced prep school catalogs. His father's pharmaceutical empire, ensuring every teacher knew exactly how much their jobs depended on keeping Dylan happy. He moved through hallways with 3 loyal disciples: Isaac Martinez, trailing behind with nervous energy; Lauren Walsh, trying to balance friendship with her conscience; and Brandon Cole, whose family owned half the town's real estate. The morning of October 15th began like every other Tuesday. Grace arriving at 7:30 a.m. to prepare lessons, while the building held only janitors and early bird students. She'd developed this routine specifically to avoid the social minefield that Willowbrook became once classes started, preferring the sanctuary of her empty classroom to the careful navigation required around students who could end careers with a single phone call to the right parent. Her British literature class was scheduled for 3rd period, Dylan's least favorite subject and Grace's biggest challenge. He'd made his contempt for dead white guys writing boring poems abundantly clear, but something darker lurked beneath his academic apathy. Grace had caught him staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, the kind of predatory focus she recognized from another life. The attack began at exactly 2:47 p.m. Grace was explaining the psychological complexity of Lady Macbeth when Dylan stood up without permission, his chair scraping against linoleum with deliberate loudness. "Miss Mitchell," he said, voice carrying the entitled tone of someone who'd never heard the word no applied to himself. I think we need to discuss your teaching methods. 29 other students shifted nervously in their seats, sensing the electric tension that preceded Dylan's cruelest moments. Isaac looked uncomfortable. Lauren's eyes darted between Dylan and Grace with obvious worry, but none of them would risk Dylan's wrath by interfering. "Mr. O'Brien, please take your seat so we can continue," Grace replied, her voice steady despite the alarm bells screaming in her mind. She'd seen this stance before, the predatory circle walk of someone testing their prey's defenses. "Actually, I think you need to take yours." Dylan moved closer, his expensive cologne mixing with something darker, more dangerous. "See, my dad and I were talking about your qualifications last night, and we're wondering exactly what makes you think you're qualified to teach at a school like this." Grace's pulse quickened, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "My credentials are available through the administration office if your family has questions about—" "Oh, we already checked." Dylan's smile turned predatory. "Funny thing is, Grace Mitchell didn't exist before 2016. No college records, no previous teaching positions, no references that check out. It's almost like you appeared out of thin air." The classroom fell silent, except for the nervous rustling of papers and the distant sound of other classes continuing their normal routines. Grace felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the one that came when her carefully constructed world showed cracks. "I don't know what you're implying," she said carefully, "but I suggest you return to your seat before this conversation becomes a disciplinary matter." Dylan laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Disciplinary matter, lady. My family donates more to this school in 1 year than you'll make in 10. You think Principal Morrison is going to choose some fake teacher over the O'Brien family?" He stepped closer, close enough that Grace could see the cruel calculation in his eyes, the way he fed off the fear he created in others. This wasn't random teenage rebellion. This was systematic predation by someone who'd learned that money and power made consequences disappear. "You know what I think." Dylan's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "I think you're hiding something big, and I think it's time the whole school found out exactly who Grace Mitchell really is." The threat hung in the air like poison gas, toxic and inescapable. Grace had spent 8 years building this identity, this life, this careful distance from everything that had nearly destroyed her. She'd changed her appearance, her mannerisms, even her voice, becoming someone completely different from the person who'd once been featured on magazine covers and Olympic promotional materials. But Dylan O'Brien had found the cracks. "Mr. O'Brien?" Grace's voice carried a warning that made Isaac shift uncomfortably in his seat. "You're out of line. Return to your seat immediately." "Make me." Dylan stepped even closer, his bulk designed to intimidate despite Grace's obvious composure. "Come on, teach. Show us what you're really made of." The next few seconds unfolded with the crystalline clarity that comes during life-altering moments. Dylan reached out, his fingers grabbing the collar of Grace's conservative blouse, the fabric tearing slightly as he pulled her closer. His intention was clear: humiliate her in front of the class, establish his dominance, remind everyone exactly who held power at Willowbrook High. He had no idea what he'd just awakened. Grace's body responded before her mind could intervene. 8 years of suppressed muscle memory exploding into perfect technique. Her left hand trapped Dylan's wrist. Her right palm struck his elbow with surgical precision, and her right leg swept his support leg while her hip rotated into the throw. The movement was so fluid, so devastatingly efficient, that Dylan was airborne before he realized he'd lost control. He hit the ground hard, his jaw connecting with the corner of a desk with a sound like a baseball bat hitting concrete. The crack echoed through the classroom, followed immediately by the wet sound of blood hitting linoleum, and Dylan's unconscious body going completely limp. Silence. 30 students stared in absolute shock at their supposedly timid English teacher standing over the motionless form of Willowbrook High's most feared bully. Grace's chest rose and fell with controlled breathing, her stance still perfect, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. Isaac broke the silence first, his voice barely a whisper. "Holy shit! Miss Mitchell just killed Dylan O'Brien." The words snapped Grace back to reality, the horrifying recognition of what she'd done crashing over her like a tsunami. She dropped to her knees beside Dylan's unconscious form, checking for a pulse with hands that had once been featured in medical textbooks for their precision under pressure. "Call 911, she commanded, her voice cracking slightly. "And get Principal Morrison. Now." Lauren was already dialing, her phone shaking in her hands as she spoke rapidly to the emergency dispatcher. Other students had their phones out, some calling for help, others recording everything for social media posterity. Within seconds, the video would be uploaded, shared, and viral. Grace knelt beside Dylan, applying pressure to the bleeding while her mind raced through everything that was about to happen. The police would come, questions would be asked, backgrounds would be investigated, and Grace Mitchell's carefully constructed identity would crumble under the weight of genuine scrutiny. Dylan stirred slightly, consciousness returning with obvious confusion and pain. His jaw was clearly broken, possibly his cheekbone too, but he was alive and coherent enough to understand that his world had just shifted dramatically. "You," he whispered through swollen lips, "you're not a teacher." Grace met his eyes, seeing fear there for the first time since she'd known him. "No," she whispered back, "I'm not." Principal Morrison burst through the classroom door at exactly 2:51 p.m., his usually perfect composure shattered by the scene before him. Diana Morrison had run Willowbrook High for 12 years, navigating the delicate politics of entitled students and powerful parents with the skill of a diplomatic surgeon. She'd never faced a situation like this. "Miss Mitchell, what in God's name happened here?" Grace stood slowly, her professional mask sliding back into place despite the blood on her hands and the obviously unconscious student at her feet. Dylan became physically aggressive. I defended myself, and he was injured during the altercation. Emergency services are en route. Morrison's eyes darted between Grace, Dylan, and the 30 witnesses whose phones were still recording every word. The political calculation was written clearly on her face. The O'Brien family's influence weighed against whatever liability Grace's actions might create for the school. "Students, put your phones away immediately," Morrison commanded, though she knew it was far too late. "Miss Mitchell, I need you to come with me to my office while we wait for the paramedics." "I'm not leaving him." Grace knelt back down beside Dylan, checking his pupils for signs of concussion. "He needs medical attention, and I'm responsible for his condition." The irony wasn't lost on her. Spending 8 years hiding from violence only to have it explode back into her life while protecting someone who'd been trying to destroy her. But Grace had learned long ago that power came with responsibility, and her power had just shattered a 17-year-old's jaw. Paramedics arrived at 3:04 p.m., their professional assessment confirming what Grace already knew. Dylan had sustained a fractured mandible, possible cheekbone fracture, and mild concussion, but no life-threatening injuries. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, His eyes never left Grace's face, the confusion there slowly transforming into something that might have been respect. Detective Marcus Walsh arrived 20 minutes later, his weathered face and careful eyes suggesting someone who'd seen enough violence to recognize its different varieties. Grace had dealt with police before, in another life, under circumstances that would remain buried if she had anything to say about it. "Miss Mitchell, I'm going to need a statement about what happened here." Walsh's voice was professional but not unkind. "The students have given me their accounts, but I'd like to hear your version." Grace nodded, settling into the chair across from Morrison's desk while preparing to give the performance of her life. Everything depended on selling the story that Grace Mitchell, mild-mannered English teacher, had simply gotten lucky during a student's physical assault. "Dylan became verbally aggressive during class, then physically grabbed my clothing," she began, sticking as close to the truth as possible. "I defended myself, and he fell, striking his head on a desk. It happened very quickly." Walsh studied her carefully, his experienced eyes noting details that Morrison had missed. Grace's stance, even while sitting, suggested physical training. Her hands, now cleaned of Dylan's blood, showed calluses consistent with martial arts practice. Most telling of all, her breathing and heart rate remained controlled, despite having just seriously injured someone. "Miss Mitchell, have you had any self-defense training?" Grace felt the first crack in her armor. The question she'd been dreading but knew was inevitable. Basic self-defense, yes. Women's safety courses, things like that. It was a lie, but a small one compared to the massive deception she'd been living for 8 years. Walsh made a note, his expression suggesting he wasn't entirely convinced but lacked grounds for further investigation. "The O'Brien family is quite influential in this community," Walsh observed carefully. "They're likely to have questions about how their son sustained such serious injuries from what you're describing as a simple defensive action." Grace met his eyes steadily, calling upon every acting skill she'd developed during her years of hiding. "I understand their concern, Detective, but Dylan was the aggressor, and 30 students witnessed the entire incident. I defended myself, and I'm deeply sorry he was injured, but I won't apologize for protecting myself from physical assault." The interview continued for 45 minutes. Walsh probing for inconsistencies while Grace maintained her story with the precision of someone whose life depended on it. When he finally closed his notebook, she felt the first small victory in what promised to be a very long war. "We'll need you to remain available while we complete our investigation," Walsh said, handing her his business card. "And, Miss Mitchell, if there's anything you haven't told me, anything at all, now would be the time." Grace accepted the card, forcing her hand not to tremble. "I've told you everything, Detective. I'm a teacher who defended herself from a student's assault. Nothing more, nothing less." As Walsh left, Grace remained in Morrison's office, staring out the window at the carefully manicured grounds where wealthy teenagers played at being adults, while their parents bought them immunity from consequences. Her phone buzzed constantly, notifications from social media platforms where the video was spreading like wildfire. "Grace," Morrison's voice carried a note of genuine concern. "The O'Brien family is demanding answers. Richard O'Brien is flying back from Switzerland tonight, and he's not known for his restraint when his family is threatened." Grace turned from the window, meeting Morrison's worried gaze. "Are you asking me to change my statement?" "I'm asking you to consider the political realities of this situation. The O'Brien family has significant influence, not just at this school, but throughout the district. If they decide you're a threat, then what?" Grace's voice carried a hint of steel that made Morrison blink in surprise. "They'll destroy my career, ruin my reputation, make me disappear." The words hung between them, loaded with implications that Morrison couldn't possibly understand. Grace had faced worse than angry billionaires, had survived threats that made Richard O'Brien's influence look like playground politics. But those were battles fought by Grace Patterson, Olympic hopeful and martial arts prodigy, not Grace Mitchell, quiet English teacher. The problem was, Dylan O'Brien had just made it impossible for Grace Mitchell to continue existing. Her phone rang at exactly 4:30 p.m., the caller ID showing a number she'd hoped never to see again. Grace stared at the screen, knowing that answering would begin the end of everything she'd built, but also knowing that ignoring it would only delay the inevitable. "Hello, Kenneth?" Grace Patterson. The voice on the other end carried 8 years of frustration, worry, and anger. "I've been looking for you for a very long time." Kenneth Davidson had been her coach, her mentor, the man who'd guided her from promising amateur to Olympic-caliber fighter. He'd also been the last person to see Grace before she disappeared, vanishing from the martial arts world without explanation or goodbye. "How did you find me?" Grace asked, though she already knew the answer. A 17-year-old's broken jaw and a video that's been viewed 2 million times in the last hour. Kenneth's voice carried bitter satisfaction. "That technique, Grace, that precise hip rotation and elbow control. I taught you that when you were 19. There's maybe 10 people in the world who could execute it that perfectly under pressure." Grace closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed life crumbling around her. "Kenneth, I can explain. 8 years, Grace. 8 years of wondering if you were dead, if you'd been kidnapped, if you'd had some kind of breakdown. Your parents hired private investigators. The Olympic Committee launched an official inquiry. And you were just gone. I had my reasons. Natalie Edwards wants to see you." The name hit Grace like a physical blow, stealing her breath and sending her stumbling backward into Morrison's desk. Natalie Edwards, the opponent she'd faced in the national championships 8 years ago. The woman whose career Grace had ended with one perfectly executed kick. The reason Grace Patterson had disappeared from the world, and Grace Mitchell had been born. "She can't," Grace whispered. "I thought she was..." Paralyzed, she was, for about 18 months. Then she fought her way back, became a Paralympic champion, and spent the last 6 years looking for the woman who changed her life forever. Grace sank into Morrison's chair, the phone trembling in her hand. "To sue me, to get revenge." Kenneth's laugh held no humor. "To thank you, you idiot. To tell you that breaking her back was the best thing that ever happened to her. To ask why you disappeared instead of staying to help her through the recovery." The words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense. Grace had replayed that moment thousands of times. The perfect technique that had gone too far. The sickening crack of Natalie's spine, the way her opponent had crumpled to the mat and never gotten up the same way again. "Grace," Kenneth's voice softened. "Where are you? We need to talk, and not over the phone." Grace looked around Morrison's office, at the diplomas and awards that belonged to Diana Morrison, at the window overlooking the privileged world of Willowbrook High, at the life she'd built on a foundation of carefully maintained lies. "Connecticut," she whispered. "Willowbrook High School in Westchester County." "I'll be there by tomorrow morning," Kenneth said. "And Grace pack a bag. After 8 years of hiding, it's time to come home." The line went dead, leaving Grace staring at her phone while the magnitude of what was happening crashed over her like a tsunami. Outside Morrison's office, She could hear the controlled chaos of a school day ending, students heading to after-school activities, teachers grading papers, the normal rhythms of institutional life continuing as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. But inside that office, Grace Mitchell was dying, and Grace Patterson was clawing her way back to life whether she wanted it or not. Her reflection in Morrison's window showed a woman caught between identities, the careful disguise of 8 years beginning to crack under the weight of exposed truth. Tomorrow, Kenneth Davidson would arrive, bringing with him questions Grace wasn't ready to answer, and a past she wasn't prepared to face. Somewhere, Natalie Edwards was probably watching the viral video, recognizing the technique that had changed both their lives forever. And, in a hospital room across town, Dylan O'Brien was learning what it felt like to be broken by someone whose power he'd never imagined, never understood, and definitely never respected. The quiet English teacher who'd defended herself against a bully was about to become the most famous person none of them had ever really known, and Grace wasn't sure any of them would survive what came next. Kenneth Davidson arrived at Willowbrook High at exactly 7:45 a.m. His presence commanding attention even in a parking lot filled with luxury vehicles. At 52, he carried himself with the disciplined bearing of someone who'd spent 3 decades molding champions, his weathered hands and intense eyes telling stories of Olympic dreams built and shattered in equal measure. Grace watched from her classroom window as he approached the main entrance, every step bringing her closer to a reckoning 8 years in the making. She'd barely slept, spending the night watching her viral video accumulate millions of views, while comment sections exploded with speculation about the mystery teacher with secret fighting skills. The knock on her classroom door came at 8:15 a.m. "Grace Patterson," Kenneth's voice carried through the hallway like a verdict. "It's time." Grace opened the door to face the man who'd discovered her talent, nurtured her potential, and watched her disappear at the peak of her career. Kenneth's eyes swept over her conservative clothing, her carefully subdued appearance, the classroom walls covered with literary quotes instead of martial arts achievements. "My God," he whispered, "you really tried to erase yourself completely." "I had to." Grace stepped aside, allowing him into her sanctuary of normalcy. "After what I did to Natalie, I couldn't—" "What you did to Natalie?" Kenneth's laugh held genuine amazement. "Grace, do you have any idea what actually happened that day?" Grace sank into her desk chair, the weight of 8 years' guilt pressing down on her shoulders. "I broke her spine with a kick that was too powerful, too precise, too devastating. I ended her career, destroyed her dreams, and nearly killed her. That's what happened." Kenneth pulled up a student desk, positioning himself directly in front of Grace, with the intensity that had made him legendary among martial arts coaches. "Grace, Natalie Edwards was on performance enhancers, steroids, growth hormones, experimental drugs her coach had been feeding her for months. That's why your kick caused so much damage. That's why her bones were brittle. That's why her recovery took so long." The words hit Grace like physical blows, each revelation shattering another piece of the guilt she'd carried for nearly a decade. "That's impossible. She would never—" "She didn't know." Kenneth's voice gentled, recognizing the fragility of Grace's emotional state. "Her coach, Marcus Webb, was dosing her supplements without her knowledge. The whole thing came out during the investigation after your disappearance. Webb lost his license, got banned from coaching, and Natalie sued him for everything he had." Grace stared at Kenneth, her mind struggling to process information that invalidated 8 years of self-imposed exile. But she was paralyzed. I saw her fall. I heard her spine. She was paralyzed for 18 months. Yes, but Grace, that kick saved her life. If you hadn't exposed Webb's doping program, if the investigation hadn't revealed what he was doing, those drugs would have killed her within 2 years. The doctors confirmed it. Her liver was already showing signs of failure. The classroom around Grace seemed to shimmer, reality shifting as fundamental truths rearranged themselves in her mind. Everything she'd believed, everything she'd built Grace Mitchell around, every reason she'd had for hiding, was crumbling under the weight of Kenneth's revelations. "She wants to see you," Kenneth continued. "Not for revenge, not for apologies, but to thank you." Grace, Natalie Edwards, became a 3-time Paralympic champion. She's now coaching the next generation of adaptive athletes, and she credits you with giving her a second chance at life. Grace's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, scrolling through news articles she'd never allowed herself to read. There was Natalie, radiant in her wheelchair, holding gold medals and speaking at motivational conferences about overcoming adversity. The woman Grace had spent 8 years believing she'd destroyed was thriving, inspiring, triumphant. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Why didn't anyone find me?" "We tried." Kenneth's voice carried 8 years of frustration. "But Grace Patterson disappeared so completely that even the FBI couldn't track you. You changed your appearance, your voice, your entire identity. We were looking for an Olympic athlete, not a small-town English teacher." The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway made both of them turn. Principal Morrison appearing in the doorway with an expression of barely controlled panic. Behind her stood a man Grace recognized from newspaper photos. Richard O'Brien, Dylan's father, and one of the most powerful people in Connecticut. "Miss Mitchell," Morrison's voice shook slightly. "Mr. O'Brien would like to speak with you about yesterday's incident." Richard O'Brien stepped into the classroom with the presence of someone accustomed to reshaping reality through sheer force of will. At 60, he possessed the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never being told no by anyone who mattered. His $1,200 suit and handcrafted shoes whispered wealth, but his eyes screamed violence barely contained by social conventions. "You're the woman who assaulted my son." O'Brien's voice carried the casual menace of someone who'd destroyed careers with phone calls. "I'm here to discuss how you're going to make this right." Kenneth stood slowly, his movement fluid and controlled, positioning himself slightly between Grace and the angry billionaire. "And you are Richard O'Brien, and you're trespassing on school property." O'Brien's attention shifted to Kenneth, recognizing another alpha predator entering his territory. "This is a private conversation." "Actually," Kenneth smiled, the expression holding no warmth. "I'm Kenneth Davidson, former U.S. Olympic Taekwondo coach, and Grace is under my protection, so this conversation just became very public." The name registration in O'Brien's eyes, the subtle shift from aggressive confidence to wary calculation. Even billionaires knew better than to challenge Olympic-level athletes without serious backup. "Your son." Grace found her voice, standing to face the man who'd raised Willowbrook High's most notorious bully. "Sexually assaulted me in front of 30 witnesses. I defended myself, and he was injured during his attack. If you want to discuss making things right, we should start with Dylan's behavior." O'Brien's face flushed red, his hands clenching into fists. "My son is 17 years old with a broken jaw and possible brain damage because some psychotic teacher decided to play action hero. I'll see you destroyed. I'll see this school sued into bankruptcy, and I'll make sure you never work again. Mr. O'Brien, Kenneth's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd faced down much more dangerous opponents. I suggest you lower your voice and reconsider your threats. Grace Patterson is not just any teacher. And Grace Patterson. O'Brien's confusion was evident, the name meaning nothing to someone whose world revolved around financial influence rather than athletic achievement. Kenneth pulled out his phone, accessing YouTube with practiced efficiency. Grace Patterson, two-time national taekwondo champion, Olympic team alternate, holder of the fastest knockout record in women's martial arts history. The technique she used on your son, she was famous for it. The video that played showed a 19-year-old Grace Patterson in competition, her auburn hair flying as she executed the exact same hip throw and elbow control that had hospitalized Dylan O'Brien. The opponent in the video, a woman nearly 6 inches taller and 40 pounds heavier, crumpled to the mat in less than 2 seconds. O'Brien watched in growing horror as Kenneth scrolled through video after video. Grace's competitive highlights showing techniques so advanced it looked choreographed. His son hadn't been injured by a lucky teacher. He'd been systematically dismantled by one of the most skilled fighters in American martial arts history. 30 million views on this highlight reel alone, Kenneth observed casually. And now that Grace's identity is public again, every major news network is going to want the story. Olympic champion turned teacher, defending herself against entitled bully. The media coverage should be extensive. The political calculation was written clearly on O'Brien's face. The recognition that his usual tactics of intimidation and financial pressure would backfire spectacularly against someone with Grace's public profile. Threatening an Olympic athlete who'd defended herself against his son's assault would make him a national villain. "What do you want?" O'Brien asked, his voice notably quieter. "For Dylan to get the help he needs," Grace said simply, "and for you to understand that your money doesn't make your family immune to consequences. Your son has been terrorizing students for years, and yesterday he finally picked the wrong target." Before O'Brien could respond, another voice interrupted from the hallway. "Dad, stop!" Dylan O'Brien appeared in the doorway, his jaw wired shut, but his eyes clearer than Grace had ever seen them. The arrogance and entitlement that had defined him were gone, replaced by something that might have been humility. "Dylan, what are you doing here?" O'Brien's parental concern warred with his fury. "You should be in the hospital." Dylan moved carefully into the classroom, his movements showing the pain of his injuries, but also a determination Grace hadn't expected. He looked directly at her, then at Kenneth, finally settling his gaze on his father. Through his wired jaw, Dylan's words came slowly but clearly. "Miss Mitchell, I'm sorry. Miss Mitchell, I was wrong, and I deserved what happened." The apology hung in the air like a confession, simple words that carried the weight of genuine recognition. Grace studied Dylan's face, seeing past the physical damage to something she'd never noticed before, fear that went deeper than yesterday's violence. "Dylan," she said gently, "why did you attack me?" Dylan glanced at his father, then back to Grace, his next words barely audible. "Because you reminded me of her, of Mom, before she stopped fighting back." The revelation hit the room like a bomb, O'Brien's face going pale as his son exposed family secrets in front of witnesses. Grace understood immediately, recognizing the cycle of abuse that created bullies like Dylan, children who learned power through violence because it was the only language their families spoke. "Son," O'Brien's voice carried a warning. "That's enough." "No, Dad," Dylan straightened despite his obvious pain. "It's not enough, Miss Mitchell. I've been watching the videos of you fighting, and I understand now. You could have killed me yesterday, but you didn't. You used just enough force to stop me, nothing more. That's real strength." Grace felt tears threatening again, this time for the broken teenager who'd spent years mimicking his father's worst behaviors because he'd never seen anything else. "Dylan, strength isn't about hurting people. It's about protecting them, including protecting them from your own power." "I want to learn," Dylan said simply. "Not to fight, but to control myself the way you do. Will you teach me?" The request stunned everyone in the room. The idea of Grace training the boy she'd hospitalized seemed impossible. But looking at Dylan's earnest expression, Grace saw an opportunity for redemption that went far beyond her own guilt. "Under one condition," Grace said finally. "You get counseling for whatever your father did to create this pattern, and you apologize to every student you've ever bullied." Dylan nodded eagerly, while O'Brien's face cycled through rage, denial, and finally a resignation that suggested his son's words had hit closer to truth than comfort. "This conversation is over," O'Brien announced, but his authority had evaporated, replaced by the hollow bluster of someone whose threats no longer carried weight. As the O'Briens left, Kenneth turned to Grace with an expression of pride mixed with amazement. 8 years of hiding, and you're still the same person who chose teaching over fame, healing over hurting. "What happens now?" Grace asked, feeling the weight of her exposed identity settling around her like a new skin. "Now," Kenneth smiled, "you decide who you want to be. Grace Patterson, the competitor. Grace Mitchell, the teacher. Or someone entirely new who combines the best of both." Over the following weeks, Grace's story spread beyond viral videos into genuine cultural conversation. Talk shows wanted interviews, sports networks requested features, and the Olympic Committee quietly inquired about her plans for the upcoming trials. But Grace found herself most inspired by the students who approached her with their own stories of hidden talents, suppressed dreams, and the courage to finally embrace their authentic selves. Dylan O'Brien returned to school after 3 weeks. His jaw healed, but his perspective permanently altered. True to his word, he spent months apologizing to former victims and began attending therapy sessions that slowly revealed the source of his learned violence. Under Grace's careful guidance, he channeled his physical strength into protecting others rather than intimidating them. Isaac Martinez found confidence he'd never known he possessed. Lauren Walsh started a peer counseling program. And Brandon Cole discovered that real leadership came from lifting others up rather than holding them down. Grace herself evolved into something she'd never imagined. A teacher who used martial arts principles to build character, confidence, and community among students who'd never believed they possessed inner strength. Her classroom became a sanctuary where academic excellence and personal growth intertwined, where literature lessons included discussions about the warrior's code and the responsibility that came with power. The Olympic Committee's formal invitation arrived in January, a chance to compete in the trials for a spot on the team representing everything Grace had once believed she'd lost forever. She stared at the official letterhead, feeling the pull of old dreams and new possibilities. But her answer came not from ambition or nostalgia, but from the handwritten notes her students had left on her desk. "Thank you for showing me that quiet strength is real strength. Thank you for teaching me that my past doesn't define my future. Thank you for proving that heroes can look like English teachers." Grace Patterson Mitchell, as she now called herself, would compete in the Olympic trials not as a comeback story, but as a demonstration that growth, redemption, and authentic power could coexist in ways that transformed everyone they touched. Sometimes the greatest victories happen not in arenas or stadiums, but in classrooms where broken teenagers learn to heal, where hidden champions discover their true calling, and where the quiet ones finally understand that their strength was never meant to be silent. If Grace's story resonates with your own journey of self-discovery, share your thoughts about the moments when you found courage you didn't know you possessed. These stories of transformation remind us all that our greatest fears often guard our most powerful gifts, and sometimes breaking open is the only way to become whole. The shy teacher who broke a bully's jaw had become something far more dangerous to the status quo, a woman who refused to hide her light and inspired others to shine theirs just as brightly. Years later, when former students would tell their own children about Miss Patterson Mitchell, they wouldn't remember her Olympic achievements or viral fame. They'd remember the way she taught them that true strength protects rather than dominates, that vulnerability requires more courage than violence, and that the most profound victories happen when we choose to transform pain into purpose. Grace had learned that hiding your gifts serves no one, but sharing them with wisdom and compassion can change the world one student, one moment, one perfectly executed lesson at a time.